Okay, today my guest is Professor Tina Ambos. I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with her. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Tina as a person. Professor Ambos is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally is a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of her accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Professor Ambos served as the Associate Editor for Long Range Planning and is a member of the Consulting Editors Board of JEBS. She sits on the editorial review boards of Management International Review, Journal of International Management, Global Strategy Journal, and Long Range Planning. Tina's research and teaching interests include global strategic management and innovation in the context of MNCs, technology startups, and international non-for-profit organizations. She is also the director of I2I Hub for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the Geneva School of Economics and Management. Thank you, Tina, for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
First question, what did you want to become when you were a child?
Actually, that's a super tough question. And I always admire everybody who has a kind of sharp answer to this, because I think I was an unusual child in the sense that I was always very undecided. I was always inspired by many different things, many different professions. But I never had this clear, I want to become this. But I think this is somehow also reflected in what I do now as an academic. I think we're all wearing, many different hats. We're researchers, we're kind of mentors, we lead teams, we teach. So I think I kind of enjoy this multifaceted aspects of the job. So yeah, kind of stayed the same.
Where did you grow up?
Actually, I grew up in Vienna in Austria. And I think at the time when I was a child, there was still the Iron Curtain there. So there was an end to where you could go and, what international meant, because that's a question you ask many other people, right, in terms of this distinction between foreign and domestic. And for me as a child, it was really kind of, with border controls in Europe, you'd go to Italy, you'd have a different language, you'd have completely different things that you could buy there. So I think that was always something that was very fascinating to me as a child, also early on But when I grew up, my parents took me traveling, and I was also inspired by some of my teachers. In my teenage years, I think I already did a lot of travels to unusual places like India or Yemen. And I think that kind of kept my, interest and my inspiration for international in general. And I was always intrigued by how different cultures work, what you can see in different contexts, just kind of, trying to understand more about, why people do what they do, why they behave, how they behave. I guess I wouldn't have the patience to become an ethnographer, but I was always kind of inspired by how things work differently in different countries.
Perfect. Tina, how did you choose academia? And then after you chose academia, how did you choose IB?
Yeah, I think it was more process than a conscious choice. So I was certainly not that child sitting in a sandbox and saying, I want to be a professor. I more or less kind of stumbled into that. I think what really kind of intrigued me was always the research element and the diversity and the exchange you had, right? So working with companies, interviewing people, doing surveys, having contacts with the academic world, and of course the intellectual exchange, but also this kind of close connections that you could have with students and with managers. And I think this is something that I always found very inspiring. But I have to say, I reconsidered a few times, like, is an academic career really what I want? It wasn't a kind of straight path for me mentally. I thought about leaving academia for a couple of times, but I think now I'm very happy that I actually made the whole journey and that I'm doing what I do today.
Perfect. Something that is not on your CV, what's something not many people would know about you?
I hope many things that are not on my CV. I think in terms of hobbies and private life, I like traveling. I like good food and drink, and I have a passion for sailing and skiing. So divided in the summer and winter sports. But actually, something that is on my CV, but not many people know, is I also have an undergraduate degree and a master's degree in philosophy. And actually, I think a lot of what I learned about, international and understanding different contexts is part of what I learned in my philosophy studies. I was exposed to a couple of professors who specialize in intercultural philosophy, so having to do a lot with epistemology. How do we understand, the world? Is philosophy only a Western concept, or do we have different approaches to that? And I think a lot of what I learned there really kind of helped my understanding of research on knowledge management, which I started out when I did my PhD, and really the kind of intellectual interest for what is the baseline of international business. So it was not so much the business studies that inspired me there, but it was really like my philosophy training, I think.
Perfect. About sailing, are you competitive? Is this a hobby, leisure? What is it?
Of course, I'm always competitive in whatever I do, but no, sailing is more a hobby that we do as a family. But my two sons, they're really competitive. So they're 10 and 12 years old, and they sail Optimists now, and they kind of, we accompany them to regattas almost every weekend. So it has become a kind of a parent competition as well.
Perfect. Okay, regrets. Have you got any?
I'm sorry?
Regrets.
Regrets. Oh my God. Yeah, many. No, I think in general, I'm a forward-looking person, trying not to have too many regrets. And I think looking back, most things in my life turned out pretty nicely. So I think also I shouldn't have too many regrets. But I think the biggest one, looking back at my career, is kind of in a way rushing through it, always feeling a lot of pressure to kind of work on the next paper, to publish, to achieve this, to go to next place. And I think having a bit more patience and being able to enjoy things a little bit more would have been great. And I mean, it's also something I always tell my students, especially when they're going like for postdoc phase. So, well, this is the time in your life where you can really kind of, you do research, you have intellectual exchange, you're not burdened by the administrative task at the university or any other roles and any other hats you have to wear. So I think, yeah, in terms of regrets, this would be one, to just enjoy life a little bit more.
What are you most passionate about?
Well, I think as a parent, privately, it's certainly kids, and very specifically that we had a sabbatical in Singapore a year ago, and we also took them to a lot of trips to countries in Southeast Asia, like to Vietnam and Cambodia, like pretty down to earth. And I think the way how they understand the international dimension, how they adapt to different cultures, how they also kind of basically, enjoy being in such an environment. I think that's kind of something which I'm very passionate about, which I think is part of, growing up and trying to understand the world. In terms of work, I think what I'm passionate about is the interaction with people, whether that's colleagues or students or people that are involved in research, and this idea that somehow you can make some kind of impact. And when I see people coming back to me and say, well, I've learned this, so I've done this now, and you feel you have like a tiny bit of influence on their lives, I think this is fantastic. And this is something that I really enjoy.
Perfect. Can we switch to research and talk about, first of all, how do you explain your research to people who don't read you regularly? And how do you explain why your research is important?
Mm-hmm. Yes, if I would kind of try to put this in a very kind of down-to-earth manner, I would probably, sit somewhere in a bar or in a pub, if that's possible again after COVID, and try to, tell somebody, if somebody came up with a smart idea in your community, whether that's, how to build a school in a day or how to make plants grow in a kind of dry environment, then that's a great thing, but it only helps your community. So how can you make sure this is actually also being used in other parts of the world, maybe in other countries, and accessible to other people? So you as a person would have to go to some kind of, organizational headquarters in shiny towers in New York or Geneva and convince the people there that actually you had a great idea and we need to scale that. And even if you manage that, the next step is to say, how can we implement this in different countries, and how can we actually make sure that, people who speak different languages, have a different cultural understanding, have different infrastructure, can also use your ideas. Mm-hmm. And then the third step is actually, even if that's possible, how can we make sure that any organization that sees another innovation of the kind would recognize it earlier and, kind of absorb it and be able to scale it? So I think this would be my translation for the big question, how we can manage organizations where people can be entrepreneurial, where they can come up with new ideas and not only make impact locally, but scale it, diffuse it, and also result in organizational learning.
Tina, can I ask you about this I2I hub?
Sure.
What is it? What do you guys do?
Yeah, that's exactly the question that I just tried to explain. How do especially social innovations come up in international organizations? I'm working in Geneva a lot with the United Nations organization, and we're trying to help these organizations of how to harness innovation better, how to make sure that entrepreneurial ideas actually, come up, are diffused in the organizations, and also how that transforms organizations in terms of, developing skills for learning, absorb the capacity. And why it's called I2I, it's innovation and entrepreneurship, the two I's, but it's also a metaphor for an I2I level of knowledge exchange. So usually when we do workshops and we work with practitioners, we try not to invite by hierarchy, but we try to involve those people in a discourse who really have the knowledge, who have the skills, who have the interest and passion for their work.
Interesting. How long has it been going on?
It's been going on for 3 years now.
Very nice.
And so the idea is kind of really to be at the intersection of research and practice. We obviously do academic papers, but we also work a lot with practitioners, do applied research, publish reports, and hope that it will make some impact.
Very interesting. Thank you. About academic research, what are some of the omitted variables or understudied areas in IB?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, right? And I was sneaking on the interviews of other people who actually, what did they respond? But I think really, obviously in social sciences, you always have a number of omitted variables, but I think the most difficult one in IB is context, right? So if we include too much context, we're kind of in local research and our results are not generalizable anymore, and that's difficult. But also if we omit those context variables, we won't get any meaningful results that inform our theories, right? So I think striking this balance between how much context to include and not to, I think it's the toughest choice in IB, really.
So if a PhD student comes to, doctoral consortium and, he or she is looking for a super interesting, groundbreaking dissertation topic and very excited about working on something extremely new, what's the research question that you would give to this person and say, this is the future of IB in the next 5 years?
Oh my God, I think usually the PhD students have much better ideas for research questions than I do. And usually it's the PhD students coming with like all those great questions and me kind of tuning them down. But I think in terms of methodologies, there's a lot of, impact, of course, machine learning, natural language processing. I think a lot is going to change in terms of how we're going to do research in the next couple of years. So it certainly gives some, very dry and, probably, technical advice to students to really become experts in the methodology that is upcoming. In terms of the real questions, I think in IB, we've seen this, and in academic research in general, we've seen this real push towards, say, the social questions, grand challenges of the world, which I appreciate. And I also do work in this area, as you just noted. But I think we need to do a lot more to kind of anchor this more to our theories and make them more kind of applicable to the management world rather than to have an ivory tower discourse in this area. So I think everything that's related to the grand challenges, but actually connects to what we already know about organizations, what we know about management, and really tries to also kind of make sure how this is going to be applied in different contexts, meaning in the developed world, in emerging economies. I think we are way too generalistic when we speak about grand challenges and social problems these days. And I think there's a lot more work to do to make them actually more tangible. And I think the other big field that everybody obviously is talking about is digitalization. But again, with digitalization, not just using it as a buzzword, but really trying to understand the exact applications, the exact challenges. So basically on all these big questions that we're seeing these days, adding more granularity and being sure how to really apply this in a context.
Perfect. I normally ask, especially the most sage people in our field, what is the evolution of IB? How was it 30 years ago, 40 years ago? Where is it going? I want to ask you something different, related but different. How is the research based, especially on these topics, in Europe versus America? I mean, you're very active in the field. In these conferences, you're very active. I mean, you see the differences in the American IB research versus the European IB research, or even the Asian, right? Or many different other parts of the world. How do you see these differences? What's their main focus, and where is it going that way?
I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but in terms of looking back, and I can't do the like 30 years, but I think during the time I've been active, which is almost 20 years now, I think American researchers in general have become more heterogeneous and Europeans have become more homogeneous. I think like many years ago, there was always this big debate that, Europeans do all this kind of qualitative research and it's very different, it's maybe not as rigorous. I think overall in the discipline, we've seen more push towards rigorous methodologies. And I think also towards more rigorous theories, which I think is a very good thing. And what I particularly like in IB is that we can also, cherish this level of diversity. So I think the differences between what is, US-based research versus European research versus Asian research, I think it's diminishing, but not in a bad way. So that is all kind of becoming a global village and all the same. But I think that overall, we as scholars are more inclusive of other contexts and more aware of other approaches. But maybe that's a too positive view, but at least that's how I see it. And I think the other element is, I think, especially in Europe, that I think European schools, by, participating more in the publishing game, European scholars publishing in top journals, I think that wasn't so common like 20 years back, right? There were a few, but mostly those with, Anglo-Saxon training and not necessarily those, growing up in especially Central Europe. So I think there's been a lot of push towards rigorous research and a lot more confidence also that, asking different questions and having different views can also be done in a rigorous way and is also, acceptable and can be done at the highest standard. Perfect.
And this question I'm now asking pretty much everyone. I'm really curious because we're working on this thing. What's going to be I won't say future. Some people argue that globalization is going to be increasing, MNCs are going to gain more power, and some people say, well, it's going to be a bit different. Nationalism, populism is going to take over. And since you're in Switzerland, you're indifferent, I'm hoping. What's going to happen? More nationalism or more globalization?
Oh gosh, I mean, you're I guess more an expert on this than I am, but I think, what I see at the moment, especially during the pandemic, something that is, I think, very negative, quite regrettable, that we're seeing more nationalism, more not only more nationalism on a political level, but less of a cooperative environment between countries. And this is particularly damaging in Europe because you have small countries, right? Mm-hmm. I think, the bigger countries are easier it's easier for them to strive and thrive on their own. But for the smaller countries, and especially in Europe, as integrated as we are, closing borders, having very different rules and regulations in different countries, I think is really detrimental. And I think we can already see this economically in terms of, lagging behind what's happening in Asia at the moment. And I think we'll also very soon see this on like an educational level in terms of the quest for talent. So I think this is something that I find really concerning at the moment. I think if we look at the overall figures of globalization versus deglobalization, it's always going to be in a biggest picture that some parts of the of the world are going to be more integrated and others are actually growing apart. Mm-hmm. But I think I'm particularly concerned about Europe. And the second element I'm particularly concerned is as I work a lot with the United Nations, is the the international institutions of how we're going to build consensus in this world, how we're going to, come on the same page for the big questions, how to address the grand challenges, what
Right.
impact can international organizations have, what are our processes of discourse. So I think this is something that I'm quite concerned about. I hope that it might be time to renew these organizations and to find a new place in this world, but I'm also a bit skeptical about the bureaucratic hurdles and long decision-making processes that are usually not very effective.
Perfect. Can we switch to mentoring for the sake of time? What was the best advice you received from your advisor when you were going through either the PhD program or going through college?
Wow. I think I try to think about this, but I think it's difficult to have like the one advice I got. And I think there was not the golden bullet that I got or saw at some point, but I think it's really a lot between the lines and a lot of learning and working with colleagues, with my PhD advisor, but also with mentors throughout my career, that I've actually learned a lot about how academia works, a lot on what matters. And I think the most important learning, and that was more an insight than an advice, is like, academia, it's a small world, right? People know each other and you have extremely long careers. So you stick around for a while, and it's also important, how you behave in this network, what you contribute, that you take on specific roles, that you're seen as somebody who will do a good review and not always say no. So I think this is an important learning that I think I'd pass on to junior colleagues, that it's not only about what is in your paper, it's also kind of how you act as a member of the academic community and the role you play there.
I mean, you just combined a couple of questions into one. Like, what are the major issues that young scholars, junior faculty have, the mistakes they make, and what's the takeaway? Like, if you could give 2 or 3 short takeaways, do this, don't do that, what would those be?
Mm-hmm. I think the first one is take your time to know your topic, to know your tools, to know the literature, and really take your time to think deeply about the problem. I think there's this saying by Oscar Wilde, who actually said, well, the answers are all out there, we just have to ask the right questions. And I think often in our research process, and particularly PhD students, we don't ask the right questions. So and often because we don't understand the problem well. So I think first trying to understand the problem really well, trying to master, the knowledge and the theories that cover this issue. I think that's the first thing. So really know that well, and then don't, rush on to next things until you've covered it. A second is stay humble, because I think well, in academia and in general, once we've published something or we think we have some insights, some people tend to kind of really think they found the philosopher's stone or something. There's always something new. There's always something different. There's always a challenging question that you can receive. So I think that's also something that's very important. And I think the third one is this kind of mix of patience and impatience. I think you have to be extremely patient to be successful in academia in terms of perseverance for the review process, for long data collections, analysis, and so on. But also you have to have a bit of a go-getter mentality, that you have to get up on your feet and do certain things and not just sit there and wait for the world to come to your desk, right? It won't happen. So I think it's a little bit this balance between being patient and impatient at the same time.
Perfect. What is one question I should have asked you but haven't?
I'm not sure you should have asked this, but a question actually that you didn't ask, which I in fact appreciate. You didn't ask kind of, female careers or dual career couples or anything the like, because usually in all interviews I kind of get some questions like, as a woman, how do you juggle, your profession and your family life? And I also note that on your interviewees, you had a couple of people who are part of dual academic careers, right? Like Ramudam, Beatrice here. As you know, my husband also is an academic in the same field. And some years ago, actually, we did a small research in the AIB community and really looking at, what are the struggles of dual career couples in academia, and also what is their output. And I think overall, it was a small study, but we found that dual career couples are often extremely effective in terms of their publications, in terms of what they achieve in their lives. And in general, I think it's a great profession if you're able to organize yourself and if you're able to kind of, juggle your different hats. But it's also a very tough profession as a woman with, very little chance to, stay in the place where you are. You have to move. You have to be internationally mobile. And there's still always a bit of a glass ceiling out there.
Sure. Thank you so much for your time. For this great interview. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Thank you so much, Tina.
Thank you so much for having me.